She'll come, Vanessa said with a laugh, lifting her champagne glass as a circle of wealthy guests gathered around her. People like Nia always come when they're invited back into a room they no longer belong in. A ripple of laughter spread through the private lounge overlooking the ballroom. Someone smirked. Someone else shook their head. You really invited your fiancé's ex-wife? A guest asked. Of course I did, Vanessa replied. Why should I miss the chance to show everyone how far some people can fall? More laughter followed. Across the room, Damien leaned against the bar and said nothing. He didn't stop her. He didn't defend the woman he had once promised to spend his life with. If anything, the faint smile on his face made it clear he agreed. Tonight's charity masquerade was supposed to celebrate their engagement, but Vanessa had another purpose in mind. She wanted every influential person in the room to see Nia Brooks walk through those doors and realize she had become a nobody. That was the plan. That was the entertainment. What none of them knew was that the story they were telling themselves had been wrong for a very long time. At that exact moment, miles away from the glittering ballroom, Nia sat alone at a small kitchen table with the invitation in front of her. The heavy cream-colored card looked expensive. The message inside felt even heavier. Vanessa had personally requested her presence. The wording was polite. The intention was not. Nia understood immediately. She wasn't being invited as a guest. She was being invited as a spectacle. She closed the invitation and stared at it for several seconds. 3 years earlier, she had been standing beside Damien at events just like this one. 3 years earlier, people had smiled when she entered a room. 3 years earlier, they had remembered her name. Then came the divorce. Then came the whispers. Then came the sudden disappearance of people who claimed to be friends. The moment she stopped being useful to the right people, she became invisible. That was the version of the story everyone believed. It was also the version Vanessa planned to celebrate tonight. Nia should have been angry. Instead, she looked strangely calm. A phone rested beside the invitation. Several unread messages waited on the screen. One of them had arrived less than 10 minutes earlier. She read it again. Then she smiled. Not because the message made her happy, because it reminded her how little Damien and Vanessa actually knew. They believed they understood her life. They believed they knew where she had been. They believed they knew what she had become. They were wrong about every single part of it. Damien thought he had already won. That mistake was about to become very expensive. The woman he remembered no longer existed. And the woman who would arrive at the masquerade was carrying a secret that could change the balance of power inside that ballroom before the night was over. Nia folded the invitation and slipped it into her purse. Outside her apartment window, the city lights stretched across the horizon. Somewhere downtown, guests were already gathering. Somewhere downtown, Vanessa was probably rehearsing another joke. Somewhere downtown, Damien was probably convinced that his ex-wife would walk into the room embarrassed and defeated. He had no idea how much had changed. He had no idea how many doors had quietly opened while he was busy looking the other way. He had no idea that people far more powerful than him knew Nia's name. And he certainly had no idea that she would not be arriving at that event as the woman he had left behind. A sharp knock sounded at her door. Nia glanced toward it. For a brief moment, the calm expression on her face softened into something unreadable. Then she stood and crossed the room. Another knock followed. Whoever was waiting outside had arrived exactly on time. Nia opened the door and looked at the person standing there. For the first time all evening, genuine surprise appeared in her eyes. The message she had received earlier suddenly made sense. Everything was moving faster than expected. And somewhere across the city, inside a ballroom filled with laughter, arrogance, and expensive lies, the first crack was about to appear in the story Damien and Vanessa thought they controlled. The man standing outside Nia's apartment was not someone she expected to see in person. He was older, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled and held out a small black envelope. I was asked to deliver this personally, he said. Nia accepted it carefully. The seal on the envelope was unfamiliar, but the name inside was not. The message was short, very short, yet by the time she finished reading it, her pulse had quickened. "Is everything all right?" the man asked. Nia folded the card and nodded. "Yes," she replied softly. "Everything is finally starting to make sense." The man studied her expression before giving a small, respectful nod. "Then I will see you tomorrow evening." After he left, Nia closed the door and leaned against it. For years she had grown used to disappointment. Opportunities usually arrived disguised as problems. Promises usually ended in betrayal. Yet this felt different. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. Across town, the atmosphere inside the Grand Aurora Hall grew louder as more guests arrived. Vanessa was thriving under the attention. Every compliment fed her confidence. Every congratulation reinforced her belief that she had won. "I cannot wait to see her face," one woman whispered. "Do you really think she will come?" another asked. Vanessa laughed. "She will come. People always want one last chance to feel important." Damien heard the conversation from nearby and said nothing. He should have felt uncomfortable. He should have remembered the years Nia spent supporting him when nobody else believed in his ambitions. Instead, he convinced himself that the past no longer mattered. That was easier. Easier than admitting he had treated someone unfairly. Easier than questioning the choices that had brought him here. Yet even he could not ignore a strange feeling growing in the back of his mind. It had started the moment Vanessa mailed the invitation. A quiet sense that something about this plan was a mistake. He pushed the feeling away. Nia was gone. Nia was struggling. Nia was no longer part of this world. That was what everyone believed. Meanwhile, back at her apartment, Nia opened an old storage box hidden in the back of a closet. Inside were photographs, documents, and memories from a life she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She picked up one picture and stared at it. In the photograph, she stood beside Damien years earlier. They were smiling, hopeful, unaware of how quickly success could change people. Nia placed the picture back into the box. She no longer felt angry when she looked at it. The anger had burned away long ago. What remained was clarity. She finally understood that some people only value loyalty when they need it. Once they reach the top, they forget who helped them climb. Damien had forgotten. Vanessa had never cared. But neither of them understood what had happened after she disappeared from their lives. Neither of them knew how many nights she had spent working until sunrise. Neither of them knew how many opportunities she had nearly lost. Neither of them knew how many powerful people had quietly taken notice while she rebuilt everything from nothing. That ignorance was about to become their biggest weakness. Her phone vibrated again. Another message appeared. This one contained only 6 words. "Everything is prepared for tomorrow evening." Nia stared at the screen. Tomorrow evening. The word seemed almost unreal. For years, she had imagined different versions of this moment. Sometimes she imagined confronting Damien. Sometimes she imagined proving everyone wrong. Sometimes she imagined simply walking away forever. Now the choice was no longer theoretical. Tomorrow had arrived. Across the city, workers continued transforming the ballroom into a spectacle of wealth and prestige. Crystal centerpieces sparkled beneath golden lights. Cameras were positioned near the entrance. Reporters prepared for celebrity arrivals. Every detail had been designed to impress. Nobody realized the most important guest on the list was the one they respected the least. As midnight approached, Nia stepped onto her small balcony and looked toward the skyline. Somewhere beyond those lights stood the people who had written her off. Somewhere beyond those lights waited the room where they planned to laugh at her. A faint smile crossed her face. They believed they knew exactly who would walk through those doors. They believed they knew exactly how the night would end. They were wrong. And less than 24 hours later, the first person to discover that truth would be Damien himself when he received a phone call that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his ex-wife. Damien was halfway through reviewing seating arrangements for the masquerade when his phone rang. He almost ignored it. The number was unfamiliar, and most of the calls he received these days were from vendors, investors, or people hoping to gain access to his network. Yet something about the timing made him answer. "This is Damien." A calm voice responded. "I apologize for the interruption. I am calling to verify whether you have any ongoing business relationship with Ms. Nia Brooks." Damien frowned immediately. "Why would you ask me that?" There was a brief pause. "Then the answer is no?" "No," Damien replied. "We have not been connected for years." The caller thanked him politely and ended the conversation without another explanation. Damien stared at the phone. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, but it left him unsettled. Why would anyone call about Nia? Why now? Across the city, Nia was finishing breakfast when her own phone vibrated. She already knew what the message would say before she opened it. Everything was moving exactly according to schedule. Not because she controlled every detail, but because for the first time in years she was no longer fighting alone. That realization still felt strange. For a long time, she had been forced to solve every problem herself. When the divorce became public, people vanished from her life with shocking speed. Friends stopped calling. Invitations disappeared. Opportunities suddenly went to someone else. She learned very quickly that loyalty often lasted only as long as success. Yet those difficult years had also taught her something important. The people who truly mattered rarely announced themselves. They watched quietly. They remembered who worked hard. They remembered character long after others became distracted by status. Nia looked out the window and took a slow breath. Less than 12 hours remained until the gala. Less than 12 hours remained until she walked back into a world that believed it had erased her. Meanwhile, preparations inside the Grand Aurora Hall reached a fever pitch. Staff hurried between tables. Photographers tested lighting. Event coordinators reviewed guest lists. Vanessa moved through the ballroom like a queen inspecting her kingdom. Every detail reflected the image she wanted people to see. Elegant, powerful, untouchable. She stopped near a group of socialites discussing the evening's guests. The conversation shifted immediately when her name entered the circle. "Have you heard anything about Nia?" one woman asked. Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Why would I waste my time keeping track of her?" The answer was obvious. She had spent weeks thinking about Nia, weeks imagining the look on her face when she entered the ballroom and saw what Damien's new life had become. Vanessa wanted validation. She wanted witnesses. She wanted everyone to see that she had won. What she did not realize was that victory obsessed her because deep down she still felt threatened. Truly confident people rarely spend this much energy thinking about someone they claim does not matter. Later that afternoon, Damien arrived at the venue for a final walkthrough. The strange phone call continued bothering him. He told himself it was nothing, yet his mind kept returning to the same question. Why would a complete stranger contact him about Nia after all these years? He found himself remembering things he had not thought about in a long time. Small details, moments from the early years of their marriage. Times when Nia had offered advice that proved correct. Times when she had noticed opportunities before anyone else. Back then he used to admire her instincts. Somewhere along the way he stopped paying attention. Success had changed many things. Perhaps it had changed him most of all. His thoughts were interrupted when Vanessa slipped her arm through his. "Everything looks perfect," she said. Damien forced a smile. Yes, perfect, but the word felt strangely hollow. As evening approached, Nia opened the garment bag hanging near her bedroom window. For several seconds, she simply looked at what was inside. Not because of the price, not because of the craftsmanship, because of what it represented. Years of sacrifice, years of patience, years of refusing to let bitterness define her future. Her phone buzzed once more. This time the message contained only a single sentence. "The guests are already talking about you." Nia smiled faintly. That was exactly what she expected. Across the city, whispers had already begun spreading through the ballroom. Some guests wondered if she would appear. Others hoped she would not. A few barely remembered her at all. Yet before the night ended, every person in that room would know her name. The only question was what would happen when the first guest recognized a detail that should have been impossible to recognize. The question followed Damien everywhere for the rest of the afternoon. What detail could possibly be important enough to make people talk about Nia again after 3 years of silence? He tried to focus on the event schedule, the guest list, the speeches, but his attention kept drifting. Every time someone mentioned the gala, he found himself wondering whether she would actually walk through those doors. Vanessa noticed the distraction almost immediately. "You are thinking about her again," she said as they stood near the ballroom entrance watching staff complete the final preparations. Damien forced a laugh. "I am thinking about the event." "Good," Vanessa replied, "because tonight should be about us." Yet even she could not completely hide her curiosity. She had spent weeks imagining Nia's arrival. In her mind, the scene always played out the same way. Nia would enter looking uncomfortable. Guests would whisper. People would compare her modest life to the success surrounding Damien and Vanessa. The contrast would be obvious. The verdict would be unanimous. Vanessa had convinced herself that public validation would finally silence whatever insecurities still lingered beneath her confidence. What she did not understand was that truly defeated people rarely inspire this level of obsession. Across the city, Nia sat quietly in front of a mirror while the evening sunlight faded beyond her apartment window. She was not thinking about revenge. She was not rehearsing speeches or imagining dramatic confrontations. She was thinking about survival. 3 years earlier, when her marriage collapsed, she had believed the worst part would be losing the relationship. She had been wrong. The worst part was discovering how many people had only respected her because of who she was married to. Invitations disappeared. Opportunities vanished. Former friends stopped returning calls. There were weeks when she questioned her own worth. Months when she wondered if everyone else had been right about her all along. But every time life pushed her backward, she found another reason to keep moving forward. Every setback taught her something. Every rejection strengthened her resolve. And eventually, without realizing it, she stopped measuring herself through other people's approval. That change became the foundation of everything that followed. Her phone lit up once again. Another message. Another confirmation. Everything remained on schedule. Nia placed the phone down and looked at her reflection. The woman staring back at her was not the same person who had signed divorce papers 3 years earlier. She had earned every lesson, every scar, every success. Meanwhile, guests began arriving at the Grand Aurora Hall. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Photographers captured images beneath sparkling lights. Influential figures from business, entertainment, and philanthropy filled the ballroom with conversation. Excitement spread quickly through the crowd. Yet beneath discussions about investments and social connections, another topic quietly circulated. Nia Brooks. Some remembered her clearly. Others struggled to place the name. A few had heard recent rumors, but dismissed them as exaggerations. One guest claimed she had seen Nia's name mentioned during a private industry conversation months earlier. Another insisted that could not possibly be true. The debate continued because nobody had enough information to prove anything. High above the ballroom, Vanessa watched the crowd gather and felt satisfaction wash over her. Everything looked perfect. Every seat was filled. Every camera was ready. Every influential guest was present. Soon Nia would arrive and confirm exactly what Vanessa wanted everyone to believe. At least, that was the story she kept telling herself. Then something unexpected happened. Near the entrance, 2 prominent guests entered the ballroom and immediately began discussing someone. Vanessa could not hear every word from a distance, but one name reached her clearly. Nia. Her smile faded for the first time that evening. Why were people still talking about her before she had even arrived? Downstairs, Damien overheard the same conversation. One of the guests sounded genuinely impressed. The other sounded confused. Neither sounded pitying. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The uneasy feeling returned stronger than before. For the first time, he found himself wondering whether he had misunderstood the last 3 years completely. Back at her apartment, Nia finally stood. The garment bag remained open nearby. The invitation rested on the table. The city lights glowed beyond the window. Her phone vibrated one final time. She looked at the message and took a slow breath. The car has arrived. Nia closed her eyes briefly before reaching for the garment bag. Across town, the ballroom doors opened to welcome another wave of guests. None of them noticed the dark luxury vehicle pulling away from a quiet apartment building. None of them knew that every assumption they had made about Nia Brooks was about to be tested. And inside that vehicle sat a woman carrying a truth that would make one very important guest realize he had spent 3 years underestimating the wrong person. The drive downtown felt strangely peaceful. Nia sat quietly in the back seat while city lights reflected across the window beside her. Years ago, she would have spent the entire ride rehearsing conversations in her head, worrying about what people thought, wondering how she would be judged the moment she walked into a room. Tonight felt different. Not because she was fearless, because she was finally free from the need to prove herself to people who had already decided who she was. The driver remained silent, respecting her privacy. The vehicle moved smoothly through evening traffic as the skyline grew larger ahead. Meanwhile, inside the Grand Aurora Hall, the energy continued building. Guests filled every corner of the ballroom. Laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved between conversations carrying silver trays. Yet despite the luxury surrounding them, a surprising number of people seemed distracted by the same subject. Nia Brooks. Vanessa overheard the name again while speaking with several donors. This time she could not hide her irritation. "I do not understand why everyone suddenly cares," she said. One of the donors shrugged. "People love mysteries." "There is no mystery," Vanessa replied sharply. "She disappeared after the divorce." The donor hesitated. "That is not exactly what I have been hearing." For the first time all evening, Vanessa felt something she did not like. Uncertainty. The feeling vanished quickly, replaced by confidence. Rumors were meaningless. Reality would arrive the moment Nia stepped through the doors. Damien was having a much harder time dismissing his doubts. The strange phone call, the conversations, the comments from guests who sounded more impressed than sympathetic. None of it made sense. He found himself remembering another version of Nia, the woman who could walk into a meeting and notice details everyone else missed. The woman whose instincts had helped him avoid costly mistakes during the early years of his career. Back then he often joked that she could see opportunities hiding in plain sight. The memory made him uncomfortable, not because it was inaccurate, because he had spent years pretending those qualities never existed. Near the entrance, 2 executives arrived and immediately attracted attention. Damien recognized both men. They rarely attended social events. More importantly, they rarely attended the same event together. As they entered the ballroom, one of them scanned the room as if searching for someone. "Who are they looking for?" a nearby guest asked. Nobody knew the answer. Across the city, Nia's vehicle finally turned onto the boulevard leading toward the Gala. Her phone vibrated again. This message came from the same unknown source that had been quietly guiding events all day. "The room is ready." Nia stared at the words for several seconds. Then she locked the screen and slipped the phone away. She still did not know every detail of what would happen tonight, but she knew one thing with certainty. The people waiting inside that ballroom believed they understood her story. They believed her life had been defined by what she lost. None of them understood what she had built afterward. The vehicle slowed as traffic increased near the venue. Through the window, Nia could already see flashes from cameras positioned outside the entrance. The event was in full swing. Back inside, Vanessa stepped onto a small stage to welcome guests. Applause filled the room as she thanked everyone for attending. She spoke confidently, smiling as cameras followed her every movement. From a distance, she looked like someone completely in control. Yet beneath that polished image, frustration continued growing. The evening was not unfolding the way she imagined. Too many people were asking questions. Too many people seemed curious. Curiosity was dangerous because it meant attention, and attention was exactly what she never wanted Nia to receive. Damien watched the speech without really hearing it. His gaze drifted toward the main entrance. He could not explain why. He only knew the uneasy feeling inside him was becoming impossible to ignore. Then one of the event coordinators hurried across the ballroom toward security. The conversation lasted only seconds, but the reaction was immediate. Several staff members suddenly moved toward the entrance. Guests noticed. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Something was happening. Outside, the dark vehicle carrying Nia rolled to a gentle stop. The driver stepped out first. A second vehicle arrived behind them moments later. Then another. People near the entrance began exchanging confused glances. Camera flashes intensified. Security personnel adjusted their positions. Nobody inside the ballroom knew exactly what was causing the sudden attention. But within seconds, word started spreading from the entrance toward the center of the room. Someone important had arrived. And when Damien finally heard the first whisper move through the crowd, the color drained slightly from his face because the name being repeated was one he never expected to hear spoken with that level of respect. The whisper moved through the ballroom faster than any announcement could have. At first it appeared in small conversations near the entrance. Then it spread from table to table. Guests who had been discussing investments suddenly stopped talking. People who barely remembered Nia's name began asking questions. The reaction made no sense to Vanessa. She stepped down from the stage and approached one of the event coordinators. "What is happening?" she asked. The coordinator hesitated. "There seems to be some confusion at the entrance." "Confusion about what?" "About a guest." Vanessa followed his gaze toward the front doors. Security staff stood unusually alert. Several photographers had abandoned their assigned positions and were now clustered near the entrance as if waiting for someone important. The sight immediately irritated her. This evening was supposed to revolve around her engagement celebration. Instead, attention was drifting elsewhere. Across the ballroom, Damien noticed the same thing. A group of executives he respected rarely reacted emotionally to anything. Yet even they appeared intrigued. One of them was checking messages on his phone, while another quietly exchanged information with a colleague. Damien moved closer. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The older executive looked up. "Not wrong. Unexpected." "What do you mean?" The man studied him for a moment. "You know Nia Brooks, correct?" Damien felt his stomach tighten. "I used to." "Interesting." That was all the executive said before turning away. The answer created more questions than it resolved. Outside, the atmosphere had become strangely electric. Nia remained seated inside the vehicle for several extra moments. Through the tinted glass, she could see camera flashes reflecting across the pavement. She could see guests arriving. She could see members of the press trying to determine why several prominent figures had suddenly gathered near the entrance. None of them knew the full story. Neither did she. Not yet. The only thing she knew was that events were unfolding differently than anyone had predicted. Her phone vibrated once more. She opened the message and read it carefully. "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned." Nia smiled faintly. 3 years ago, she would have felt overwhelmed. 3 years ago, she might have turned the car around and driven away. Back then, she still measured her worth through the approval of people who never truly valued her. Those years were gone now. She had learned something far more important. Respect that depends on status disappears when status changes. Real value survives both success and failure. That lesson had carried her through every difficult day after the divorce. Back inside the ballroom, Vanessa's frustration continued growing. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "People are acting like a celebrity is arriving." One of her friends attempted to reassure her. "It will settle down once everyone gets inside." Vanessa nodded, but the confidence behind her smile felt weaker than before. For the first time all evening, she could not predict what would happen next. That uncertainty bothered her more than she cared to admit. Damien, meanwhile, found himself replaying memories he had ignored for years. He remembered late nights when Nia stayed awake helping him prepare presentations. He remembered opportunities she recognized before anyone else noticed them. He remembered how often she believed in him when success still felt impossible. The memories arrived one after another, each one making it harder to accept the narrative he had repeated since their divorce. Perhaps the easiest version of the story was not the most accurate version. Near the entrance, another wave of whispers spread through the crowd. A well-known investor had just arrived, then a respected philanthropist, then a business leader whose schedule rarely allowed attendance at social events. What surprised everyone was that they were not gathering near Vanessa or Damien. They were all focused on the same thing, the entrance. Conversation slowed. Music continued playing softly overhead, yet the room felt quieter with every passing second. Curiosity was replacing celebration. Anticipation was replacing confidence. Outside, Nia finally reached for the door handle. The driver stepped forward immediately. The evening air felt cool as she emerged from the vehicle. Several photographers turned toward her, uncertain whether they recognized her. Others recognized her immediately and looked visibly confused. This was not the woman they expected to see. This was not the defeated figure described in whispered conversations for the last 3 years. Nia glanced toward the glowing entrance of the Grand Aurora Hall. Beyond those doors waited people who thought they knew her story. Beyond those doors waited a man who believed he understood exactly how her life had unfolded after the divorce. And beyond those doors waited a room full of assumptions that were about to collide with reality. Then, just as she began walking forward, one of the most influential guests in the city stepped out from the entrance, saw her clearly for the first time, and reacted in a way that caused every nearby conversation to stop instantly. The reaction was impossible to miss. The man who had stepped out of the entrance was Arthur Whitmore, a respected philanthropist whose endorsement could elevate entire organizations overnight. People knew him for one reason above all others. He never chased attention. Yet the moment he recognized Nia, he abandoned the conversation he had been having with 3 influential donors and walked directly toward her. Nearby guests exchanged confused glances. Cameras immediately shifted in their direction. Arthur stopped only a few feet away and smiled warmly. "It is good to finally see you again," he said. The simple greeting carried more weight than most people realized. Nia returned the smile. "Thank you for coming." Arthur laughed softly. "I would not have missed this evening." The comment seemed ordinary. The reaction around them was not. Several guests looked visibly startled. Others immediately reached for their phones. Arthur Whitmore was not known for making appearances unless something important was happening. If he was treating Nia with this level of respect, then perhaps the rumors were not rumors after all. Inside the ballroom, word spread rapidly. Vanessa watched the interaction from across the room and felt her confidence wobble for the first time. "Who is that?" one of her friends asked. "Arthur Whitmore," another answered. "Why is he greeting her like that?" Vanessa crossed her arms. "Probably charity work. He knows everyone." The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears. Meanwhile, Damien had frozen near the center of the ballroom. He knew exactly who Arthur was. More importantly, he knew Arthur rarely approached people first. The sight unsettled him. It did not fit the version of reality he had been carrying for years. The version where Nia disappeared. The version where she struggled quietly while everyone else moved on. Those assumptions were beginning to crack. Outside, Arthur and Nia continued talking for only a minute before another guest approached. Then another. Then another. None of them treated her like a forgotten ex-wife. None of them treated her like someone who had failed. They greeted her with professional respect, some with admiration, others with genuine curiosity. Nia noticed the growing attention but remained calm. She had learned long ago that the strongest response to being underestimated was not anger. It was composure. The entrance doors opened again as additional guests arrived. More cameras flashed. More conversations paused. What began as curiosity was becoming something else entirely. Anticipation. People sensed a story unfolding in front of them, even if they could not yet identify all the pieces. Back inside, Vanessa's frustration turned into determination. She refused to let the evening slip away from her. "The moment she comes in here, everyone will remember who she really is," she said. "People are getting carried away. Yet even as she spoke, she noticed several influential attendees moving toward the entrance. Not toward the stage, not toward the engagement display, toward Nia. The realization felt like sand slipping through her fingers. Attention was the currency of rooms like this. And somehow, without even entering the ballroom, Nia was already attracting more of it than anyone else. Damien watched the growing crowd near the entrance and felt a question forming that he could no longer ignore. What exactly had happened during the years they spent apart? He thought back to the divorce, back to the assumptions everyone accepted without question. Perhaps the biggest mistake had not been underestimating Nia's intelligence. Perhaps it had been assuming her story ended the moment she left his life. Outside, another black vehicle arrived. Several guests glanced toward it before quickly looking back at Nia. Whatever they expected from the evening, this was not it. Nia's phone vibrated once more. She looked down and read a short message. The timing is perfect. Her expression did not change, but something about her posture seemed different. Afterward, more certain, more prepared, Arthur noticed. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Nia slipped the phone away. "Yes," she answered. "I think it is finally time." The words meant little to the people standing nearby, but one woman overheard them and immediately felt a chill run through her. It sounded less like a guest arriving at a party and more like someone stepping into a moment they had been preparing for over a very long time. Inside the ballroom, music softened as the master of ceremonies prepared to introduce the evening's next segment. Conversations gradually settled. Guests returned to their seats. Cameras adjusted position. Attention shifted toward the entrance one final time, because at that exact moment, Nia began walking toward the doors, and standing only yards away, hidden from her view by the crowd, Damien suddenly overheard two executives discussing a name he had never heard before, a name they spoke with enormous respect, a name they somehow connected directly to Nia Brooks. Damien strained to hear the rest of the conversation, but the two executives lowered their voices before he could catch more than a few scattered words. One phrase, however, remained painfully clear. They were discussing a private organization that had become one of the most influential names in luxury development during the last 2 years. Damien knew the reputation. Everyone in the upper tiers of business knew it. Yet what unsettled him was hearing that name connected to Nia. It sounded impossible. Across the room, the master of ceremonies welcomed guests back to their seats, but very few people were paying attention anymore. The atmosphere had changed. Curiosity had taken control of the ballroom. Every glance seemed to drift toward the entrance. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question. Why were so many powerful people suddenly interested in a woman most of them believed had disappeared after a divorce? Vanessa noticed it too. She forced a smile whenever cameras turned her way, but privately, she felt the evening slipping beyond her control. This was supposed to be simple. Nia would arrive. People would remember her failures. The comparison would favor Vanessa. Instead, the exact opposite was happening. Before Nia had even entered the ballroom, she had become the most discussed person in the building. Outside, Nia paused briefly at the top of the staircase leading toward the entrance. Arthur Whitmore remained beside her, along with several respected guests who had chosen to greet her personally. The sight alone would have shocked most of the people inside. Nia understood that, yet she remained focused on something else. Not revenge, not humiliation. Truth. For 3 years, others had told her story for her. They had decided what her silence meant. They had mistaken privacy for failure and resilience for weakness. Tonight, for the first time, she would no longer allow strangers to define her narrative. As the entrance doors opened, conversations inside the ballroom gradually faded. Heads turned. Even the staff seemed distracted. A hush spread through the room in slow waves. Guests closest to the entrance saw her first, then those farther away, then everyone. Nia stepped inside with calm confidence. The gown she wore seemed to capture the light from every chandelier in the room. Elegant, timeless, impossible to ignore. Yet it was not merely the dress that caused people to stare. It was the contrast between expectation and reality. The woman entering the ballroom looked nothing like the defeated figure they had imagined. Damien felt the air leave his lungs. For a moment he could not move. He had expected discomfort, embarrassment, hesitation. Instead, Nia carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Around him, reactions intensified. Some guests whispered. Others openly stared. Several influential figures immediately stood from their tables. One by one, they approached her. Vanessa watched the scene unfold and felt panic flicker beneath her carefully maintained composure. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. She had planned an evening where Nia would feel small. Yet every second seemed to make Nia appear more important. The situation worsened when a well-known investor crossed the ballroom and greeted Nia warmly in front of everyone. Then another. Then another. Each interaction added fuel to the growing mystery. Who exactly had Nia become? Damien's thoughts raced. He remembered the years after the divorce. He remembered assuming she would eventually fade into obscurity. Now he realized that assumption had never been based on evidence. It had been based on convenience. Believing she failed made it easier to justify leaving her behind. The realization hit harder than he expected. Across the ballroom, Nia finally looked in his direction. Their eyes met for the first time in 3 years. No anger appeared in her expression. No bitterness. No desire for confrontation. Somehow that made the moment even more unsettling. She looked at him the way someone looks at a chapter they finished reading long ago. Damien felt a strange sense of loss he could not explain. Before he could react, another voice suddenly cut through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, sounding unusually excited. "We have just received confirmation regarding a very special guest and an important announcement later this evening." Immediate murmurs spread through the crowd. Nia remained calm. Arthur smiled knowingly. Vanessa felt her pulse quicken, and Damien watched as several executives exchanged significant glances. Because whatever announcement was coming, they already seemed to know something the rest of the ballroom did not. Something that would make the mystery surrounding Nia Brooks impossible to ignore. The announcement changed the atmosphere immediately. Guests who had been whispering now listened with open curiosity. The master of ceremonies smiled politely, clearly enjoying the suspense. "Details will be shared later this evening," he continued. The intention behind it was not. Nia understood immediately. Vanessa wanted to remind the room of her disappearance. She wanted to steer the conversation back toward failure and loss. For a brief moment, silence settled over the group. Guests waited to see how Nia would respond. Nia's expression remained calm. "Life happened," she answered. "And sometimes life turns out better than expected." Several people nearby smiled. Others tried to hide their reactions. Vanessa's confidence faltered for a fraction of a second. It was not the answer she wanted. Before she could recover, another voice entered the conversation. "That is certainly true." The speaker was one of the most influential investors in attendance. He stepped forward and looked directly at Nia. "In fact, I believe many people here would be shocked if they knew the full story." The room fell silent again. Even the music seemed distant. Vanessa stared at him. Damien stared at him. Nia remained composed. And then the investor glanced toward the stage where event organizers were quietly preparing something behind the scenes. Whatever announcement was coming later in the evening, he clearly knew more about it than most. The problem was that his expression suggested the truth would not merely surprise the guests. It would completely change the way they viewed the woman standing in front of them. The investor's comment lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. Guests exchanged curious glances. Some leaned toward one another and whispered theories. Others simply stared at Nia as though seeing her for the first time. Vanessa forced a laugh. "Well, now everyone is intrigued," she said. "Perhaps we should all hear this mysterious story." The attempt sounded playful, but the tension beneath it was obvious. Nia met her gaze calmly. "Some stories take time before they make sense," she replied. Several guests smiled at the response. Vanessa did not. Across the ballroom, Damien felt the uncomfortable sensation of standing on the edge of a truth he could not yet see. The more he learned, the less confident he became about everything he thought he knew. 3 years earlier, he had convinced himself that Nia would eventually fade into the background of his life. Instead, she now stood at the center of a room filled with influential people who clearly viewed her very differently than he did. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Near the stage, event staff moved with unusual urgency. Guests noticed. Every small action seemed meaningful now. Every conversation felt connected to the mystery surrounding Nia. One executive approached another and quietly pointed toward her gown. A fashion journalist joined the discussion moments later. Soon a small circle formed. Damien caught fragments of the conversation. Exclusive. Private commission. Impossible access. None of it made sense to him, yet it clearly meant something to the people discussing it. Meanwhile, Arthur Whitmore remained relaxed. He appeared almost amused by the growing speculation. A reporter finally gathered enough courage to approach him directly. "Mr. Whitmore," she said politely, "many people seem surprised by your relationship with Ms. Brooks." Arthur smiled. People are often surprised by things they should have noticed much earlier. The answer spread through the room within minutes. Each retelling seemed to make it more significant. Guests who had ignored Nia for years suddenly found themselves reevaluating old assumptions. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Respect was beginning to replace curiosity. Vanessa noticed it immediately. The shift terrified her. She had expected Nia to enter the room carrying the weight of her past. Instead, everyone else seemed determined to attach new meaning to her present. The situation worsened when another prominent guest crossed the ballroom and greeted Nia warmly. Then another followed. Each interaction made the invisible hierarchy inside the room clearer. These were not casual acquaintances. These were people whose approval carried real influence. Damien watched the growing line of respected figures seeking Nia's attention and felt regret begin to creep into places where certainty once existed. Not full regret. Not yet. But doubt. The first real doubt he had experienced in years. He remembered how easily he accepted the story others told after the divorce. Nia disappeared. Nia struggled. Nia never recovered. The narrative had been convenient because it protected him from asking difficult questions about his own choices. Now that narrative was collapsing in front of hundreds of witnesses. At the center of it all, Nia remained composed. She answered questions politely. She greeted people warmly. She never once tried to boast or draw attention to herself. That restraint only deepened the mystery. People expected successful individuals to announce their achievements. Nia did the opposite. She allowed others to talk while she listened. She allowed curiosity to grow naturally. The effect was powerful. The less she explained, the more people wanted answers. Suddenly the lights near the stage dimmed slightly. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. The master of ceremonies stepped forward again. This time the room fell silent almost immediately. Everyone sensed something important was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we continue tonight's celebration, we have been asked to acknowledge a remarkable achievement that has had a significant impact on communities across the country." A large screen behind the stage flickered to life. Guests straightened in their seats. Reporters lifted cameras. Vanessa felt her pulse accelerate. Damien stared toward the stage without blinking. Nia remained perfectly calm. Images began appearing across the screen. Charitable projects, business developments, community initiatives. The audience watched with growing interest. Then a logo appeared. The reaction was immediate. Several executives exchanged stunned looks. A journalist gasped softly. Arthur Whitmore smiled. Damien felt his stomach tighten again. He recognized the logo. Almost everyone in the room did. It belonged to an organization whose influence had expanded dramatically over the last 2 years. Yet one crucial detail had always remained hidden from public view. Nobody knew who truly stood behind it. As the presentation continued, Guests slowly began connecting pieces that had never seemed related before. The whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent, more shocked, and standing near the center of the ballroom. Vanessa suddenly realized that whatever announcement was about to follow might not simply change the evening. It might completely destroy the story she had spent 3 years telling herself about Nia Brooks. The whispers became impossible to contain. Guests who had spent years following business headlines immediately recognized the organization displayed on the screen. Its projects had transformed neighborhoods, funded education programs, and supported ambitious entrepreneurs across the country. Yet one question had always remained unanswered. Who was responsible for building it? The mystery had fueled endless speculation among journalists and industry leaders. Now that mystery was standing only a few feet away from them. The presentation continued as photographs appeared across the massive screen. Images of completed projects, community centers, scholarship recipients, business incubators, success stories that had touched thousands of lives. The audience watched in silence. Even the waitstaff seemed distracted. Then the narrator's voice filled the ballroom. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that its founder chose to remain anonymous from the very beginning. While many sought recognition, this individual chose impact over attention. A murmur swept through the crowd. Several guests slowly turned toward Nia. Others followed. One by one, eyes moved away from the screen and settled on her. Vanessa felt her chest tighten. Damien felt as if the room had suddenly become smaller. Arthur Whitmore remained calm, his expression suggesting that everything was unfolding exactly as expected. The narrator continued. Tonight, after years of privacy, the founder has agreed to step forward publicly for the first time. The ballroom fell completely silent. No whispers. No music, no movement, just anticipation. Nia stood perfectly still. She had spent years avoiding this moment, not because she lacked confidence, because she never wanted the work to become about her. Yet some truths eventually demand to be seen. The screen faded to black. Then a single photograph appeared. It was not a corporate image, not an award ceremony, not a publicity campaign. It was a candid photograph taken years earlier during the earliest stages of the organization's creation. A photograph of Nia. The reaction was immediate. Audible gasps echoed through the ballroom. Someone dropped a champagne glass. A reporter lowered her camera in complete disbelief. Vanessa stared at the screen as if refusing to accept what she was seeing. Damien felt every assumption he had carried for 3 years collapse at once. The woman he believed had disappeared after their divorce had not vanished. She had been building something extraordinary. The narrator spoke again. Please join us in recognizing the founder and visionary behind this organization, Ms. Nia Brooks. Applause erupted throughout the ballroom. It began with a handful of people, then dozens, then nearly everyone in attendance. The sound grew louder and louder until it filled every corner of the hall. Nia remained composed, but inside she felt years of struggle, sacrifice, and perseverance rushing through her all at once. The lonely nights, the rejection, the doubt, the moments when success seemed impossible. Every one of them had led here. Across the room, Vanessa could barely breathe. She remembered every joke, every insult, every assumption. She remembered inviting Nia to this event believing she would become a source of entertainment. Instead, she had accidentally created the stage for Nia's greatest public triumph. The realization was devastating. Damien felt something even worse. Regret. Real regret. For the first time, he saw the full picture. While he had been celebrating his own success, Nia had quietly built something far more meaningful. While he had listened to rumors about her failure, she had been changing lives. While he had convinced himself she needed him, she had become someone the entire room respected. The applause continued. Several guests approached Nia immediately. Investors, philanthropists, journalists, people who wanted to congratulate her personally. Yet through all the attention, Nia's gaze briefly found Damien. There was no triumph in her expression, no cruelty, no desire to embarrass him. Only calm certainty. That somehow hurt more than anger ever could, because it made him realize she was no longer seeking his approval. She had moved beyond it. As the applause finally began to fade, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone with a smile. There is one more announcement before the evening continues. The room quieted once again. Guests exchanged curious glances. Vanessa looked terrified. Damien looked exhausted. Arthur Whitmore smiled knowingly. And Nia stood calmly beneath the lights as the master of ceremonies opened a sealed envelope and prepared to reveal a second truth that would leave the entire ballroom even more stunned than the first. The ballroom remained silent as the master of ceremonies held the sealed envelope in his hands. Only moments earlier, the revelation about Nia had transformed the entire evening. Yet the expression on his face suggested the surprises were not over. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded the document inside. Over the past year, he began, a panel of independent experts reviewed dozens of philanthropic and business initiatives across the country. Their goal was to identify the individual whose leadership created the greatest measurable impact on communities, education, and economic opportunity. Guests listened intently. Reporters raised their cameras. Vanessa felt as though the floor beneath her had become unstable. Damien could barely focus. The truth he had just learned was already overwhelming. He could not imagine what else remained hidden. The master of ceremonies continued. Tonight, we are honored to recognize that individual. He paused briefly before looking toward Nia. The recipient of this year's Visionary Leadership Award is Ms. Nia Brooks. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room erupted into applause once again. Louder than before. Longer than before. People stood from their seats. Some smiled. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Several guests who had ignored Nia's existence for years now applauded enthusiastically as if they had always believed in her. Nia accepted the recognition with grace. She neither celebrated dramatically nor appeared surprised. She simply nodded politely. That restraint only increased the admiration people felt toward her. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stared at the stage in shock. She remembered every assumption she had made, every cruel joke, every conversation where she dismissed Nia as irrelevant. She had invited her here expecting humiliation. Instead, the entire room was witnessing the exact opposite. The realization was unbearable. Nearby, some guests had begun whispering openly about the irony of the situation. Vanessa heard enough fragments to understand the direction of the conversation. For the first time all evening, she felt what Nia must have felt years earlier. Judgment. Not loud, not cruel, but unmistakable. Damien's reaction was even more painful. As the applause continued, memories flooded back with relentless clarity. He remembered the early years when Nia supported his ambitions despite having dreams of her own. He remembered the advice she gave that he ignored. He remembered moments when she sacrificed opportunities because she believed in their future together. At the time, he accepted those sacrifices as normal. Now he saw them differently. He realized how much he had taken for granted. Worse, he realized how quickly he had allowed others to rewrite her story after the divorce. He had never asked what happened to her, never truly wanted to know. The guilt settled heavily in his chest. Eventually, the applause faded. The master of ceremonies invited Nia to say a few words. Every eye in the ballroom followed her as she stepped toward the stage. The room became completely still. Guests expected a triumphant speech. Some expected subtle revenge. Others expected criticism directed at those who underestimated her. Nia offered none of those things. She stood beneath the lights and looked across the audience. "Thank you," she said simply. "This recognition means a great deal to me. But success is rarely the result of one person. It comes from every lesson, every setback, every challenge, and every opportunity to grow." Her voice remained calm. "There was a time when I believed losing something important meant my story was over. I was wrong. Sometimes the end of one chapter becomes the beginning of another." The room listened in complete silence. What matters is not who believes in you during your best moments. What matters is whether you continue believing in yourself during your hardest ones. Several guests nodded. Others looked visibly moved. Damien lowered his eyes. The words felt painfully personal, even though Nia never mentioned him by name. She did not need to. The contrast between her dignity and his past behavior said everything. When she finished speaking, the applause returned once more. This time it felt different. Not excitement. Respect. Genuine respect. As Nia stepped away from the microphone, Damien finally made a decision. He could not leave without speaking to her. He crossed the ballroom slowly, ignoring the conversations around him. Vanessa noticed immediately and felt panic surge through her. She watched him move through the crowd while Nia greeted well-wishers near the stage. For the first time, she realized she might lose something far more important than attention. Damien stopped only a few feet away from Nia. She turned and saw him standing there. For several seconds, neither spoke. Around them, conversations continued quietly. The celebration moved forward. Yet for Damien, everything seemed suspended in time. Because after 3 years of certainty, he finally understood one undeniable truth. The greatest mistake of his life was standing directly in front of him. And he had no idea whether it was already too late to say the words he should have said years ago. For a long moment, neither Nia nor Damien spoke. The noise of the ballroom seemed distant, reduced to a soft blur around them. Damien looked at the woman standing before him and realized he was facing someone he no longer fully knew. Not because she had become a stranger, because he had stopped paying attention long before she transformed into the person she was now. "Nia," he finally said. His voice was quieter than she remembered. "I owe you an apology." Nia regarded him calmly. There was no anger in her eyes. No bitterness. No triumph. Only peace. "You do not owe me anything," she replied gently. Damien shook his head. "That is not true." The words came more easily once they started. "I convinced myself that you would be fine without me, but I never actually cared enough to find out. I listened to rumors. I accepted assumptions. I allowed myself to believe a story that made me feel comfortable." He paused. "And I was wrong." Nearby guests pretended not to watch, but many listened carefully. Not because they wanted gossip, because they sensed something important unfolding. Damien looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "I spent years thinking success proved I made the right choices. Tonight, I realized success means very little if you lose sight of the people who mattered along the way." Nia listened without interrupting. The ballroom that once seemed determined to judge her now stood silent as the man who had once underestimated her confronted the consequences of his own decisions. Across the room, Vanessa watched the conversation with growing disbelief. Earlier that evening, she had imagined herself standing at the center of attention while Nia struggled beneath the weight of public judgment. Instead, she found herself standing alone while the room's admiration flowed toward the very woman she had hoped to embarrass. For the first time, Vanessa understood how completely her plan had failed. Not because Nia humiliated her, because Nia never tried to. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Damien took a slow breath. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said. "And I certainly do not expect a second chance. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what I lost." Nia smiled softly. It was not the smile of someone seeking revenge. It was the smile of someone who had already healed. "The hardest lesson I learned," she said, "was realizing that closure does not come from hearing the words you want. It comes from deciding you no longer need them." Damien lowered his eyes. The truth landed with quiet force. Years ago, those words might have broken her. Tonight, they simply reflected reality. Nia was no longer waiting for validation from him. She no longer needed him to recognize her worth. She had already built a life that proved it. Around them, guests continued offering congratulations. Reporters requested interviews. Influential figures sought introductions. Yet the most important victory of the evening had nothing to do with awards, recognition, or public praise. It was the fact that Nia stood in the same room that once represented her greatest pain and felt completely free. Arthur Whitmore approached with a warm smile. "They are waiting for you," he said. Nia glanced toward a group of community leaders, investors, and partners gathered nearby. People who respected her not because of who she married, but because of what she built. She nodded and turned back toward Damien one final time. "Take care of yourself," she said. Then she walked away. Damien watched her go, understanding there was nothing left to say. Some losses could not be undone. Some opportunities only existed once. He felt regret, but beneath it was something else. Respect. Genuine respect for the woman he had failed to appreciate when she stood beside him. Across the ballroom, Vanessa remained silent. No dramatic confrontation followed. No public argument. No revenge speech. None was necessary. The evening itself had delivered the lesson. The people who once overlooked Nia now admired her. The people who doubted her now celebrated her. And the people who believed her story ended years ago now understood it had only been beginning. As the celebration continued, Nia joined the group waiting for her. Laughter replaced tension. Hope replaced old memories. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to look forward instead of backward. The city lights shone beyond the ballroom windows, bright against the night sky. Somewhere in those lights were the difficult years that shaped her. The disappointments. The sacrifices. The lonely moments when nobody believed in her future. She carried those memories with gratitude now, because they had led her here. Not to revenge. Not to victory over someone else. But to a life she created for herself. And as she smiled among people who truly valued her, one truth became impossible to deny. The woman they once underestimated had never needed to return to prove her worth. She only needed to keep moving forward until the world finally caught up with who she had become.